Welcome to Ling. I've kind of assumed that not everyone will know much about Ling. So there's a little bit of introduction at the beginning. And although my idea originally had been to kind of focus on really just largely on the archaeological findings from the survey, I got caught up in some of the history and kind of making sense of that. So in the end, the talk is kind of part a little bit on the history of Ling and part trying to make sense of some of what I've called the curiosities. Because I think Ling is probably typical in the sense that the most evident archaeology kind of falls into kind of late prehistoric period and a immediately pre and post improvement period. And then we've got this huge gap in between. And that's in spite of it having a pretty amazing history during that period. I think that's the conundrum. And I'm obviously, those of you who live on Tari or Uist or elsewhere will kind of understand how frustrating that sometimes is to fit the archaeology into the history. So ACFA came on board. We started discussing with Dougie in 2016, and the first trip was the beginning of 2017. And here we are now 4 years later, and there's an intention to finish this year and do the final report, which would be great. So just a kind of thank you, an opening thank you to the ACFA members who've kind of been with us on quite a lot of the survey weeks. So Dougie, obviously, and the stalwarts of Libby and Margaret, Ian and Fred. I think everyone's here tonight, in fact. Alison, Helen's here, I think Wendy, Christine, who managed to add to her list of islands by being here. And two of the faces on the big photo here, Zoe, who's listening in tonight, and Birgit. And I think Julia's here as well, and she appears later on. Okay, so just a little bit of introduction at the beginning. So Ling is one of the slate islands, along obviously with Easdale Island, Seal, Belnahur, and it lies between the Sound of Jura at the south, which is where the cursor is. This is Scarborough to the right. So this is the Sound of Jura here, and Firth of Lorne up here. And the mainland runs down here. And there's a smaller island of Torsa just off to the west. And you can already see from the photograph, this great aerial photo, the extent to which there's been slate quarrying, particularly nibbling around the edges of the island. It's not all slate. There's a big ridge and a few other smaller ridges of metabasite rock on which the two Iron Age dunes are built. It makes great building material. And then the rest is crisscrossed. There's a network of volcanic dikes, particularly from Mull, the Mull Dyke, which cut across. So it makes the geology quite interesting. And initially for archaeological surveyors, there's a tendency to see lots of archaeology where in fact it's geology. So it takes a while to get your eye in. And you can see here, so this is this big ridge of metabasite on the northeast side. And it has the two really fine Iron Age dunes, one of which is a Gallerid dune here of Leccamore. And what was known before the survey were 4 roundhouses or 3 roundhouses in a circular enclosure here. But the other discoveries really date from the survey itself. This is Cullypool, where Zoe and I live. And of course, we have fabulous views. Colonsay in the distance, and this is Lunga here. Very little early prehistoric evidence, in spite, of course, of a great deal of Mesolithic evidence in the wider area, both on the mainland and other islands, as well as quite a lot of Neolithic activity as well. Where the Neolithic and Bronze Age activity has been concentrated in terms of what was known so far is actually on Shuna, which is an island off the southeast edge of Ling, where there's remains of a Neolithic long cairn, 3 curb cairns, and what was found in the end of the 19th century were 3 wonderful bronze swords in a line, points down, in the same ballpark area as the cairns. So that seems to have been the little ritual area for the islands there. And in fact, the earliest evidence is a slate, a big slate with 2 rows of cut marks on it, which is integrated into the entrance of one of the Iron Age dunes. And what had been done back in 2010 was to investigate this little white lump here, which is a intertidal cairn in which there were oaks, and that's what they were dated to this difficult area of 850 to 500 BC. So late Bronze Age, early Iron Age activity. This little corner of Ling is one of my favorite, because apart from the cairn, it's got a fish trap which runs between these 2 outcrops. It's got probably 17th century. It's one of the earliest of the turf and stone dikes that runs up from this outcrop here up right over to the western side of Ling, just at the back of us at Cullypool. And it's a march dike between 2 of the early townships. And on this promontory is a croft, but it's a croft called Dunedin. And I think, although I think Dougie disagrees, but I had support from John for this, which I was very pleased about, is that this might well have been the name of the original name of what is now called Ballycastle fort here, which you see here. And then there's a little scatter of what's been called in the past dunes, but that's, I think, one of the questions is what they really are. So, of course, what is really interesting, and this is when the history of Ling, I think, gets really exciting, is as we move into the early historic period, and you've got Dalriada, and in particular, Ken Lorne, after whom, of course, Lorne is named. Although there are important sites from that period, of course, Iona, Holy Isle, Niv, which is what Dougie talked about earlier. We're going to try and do a visit to that in June. And Lismore. The only evidence on Ling itself is when this was kind of dug at the end of the 19th century, and they turfed out stone from the entrances. There was a bone pin which is diagnostically early historic. So this is one of the Alcock's early historic fortifications. And then on the parish church, the old parish church at Kilhatton, which is dedicated to St. Catherine, an Irish saint, one of the stones embedded in the wall has this, so it could be an early pendant cross. It's quite similar to the early ones down at Kilmorey and Knapdale, and a couple on Iona. And of course, this was an interesting period because we know from the history that that there were naval forces. There was a levy system for raising the fighting forces and maintaining the navy. But it came under Pictish control from mid-8th century onwards. And then, of course, the Vikings arrive. And this is where I start to get a bit nervous because I know that John's watching and he could well correct me on some of the things I'm going to say. of course, Ling itself is its a location is very interesting because it's at the north end of the Sound of Jura here. West Isla and Colonsay are kind of over here somewhere. And this is the main route up to Sound of Mull, of course, Lismore, Great Glen. So it's not only placed on quite important sea routes, but its safe harbours between Ling and the mainland have clearly been used way back into history. The closest the historical evidence is there's a battle at Inisibsurlian in the 890s, and the current expert view seems to be that this could well be the area of Seal Ling Scarborough. So it places it quite close to Ling. And there is a folk memory of a battle just really on the mainland at Barbarek, which of course it's claimed that the Picts won and that the King Olaf was slaughtered in the battle, and he's supposed to be buried in a huge cairn, which of course is a Bronze Age cairn. But again, it may be a folk memory of conflicts between what became the Isles, of course, became Norse, and the mainland, or large parts of the mainland, fell under Alba and Scots, apart clearly from coastal areas, because we see here on this map the spread not only of valley names, particularly on the north end of Jura and around the Firth of Lorne up here, but there's also a little cluster of Ness and Vic names, and we have one fjord, Melfjord or Melfort as well. What we do have on Ling, but comes late in this period because it's certainly 13th century, given that it's on the walls of a church which was built right at the end of the 12th century, are these graffiti. And I don't know if anyone's, if these are new to anyone, but they are spectacular. And these were photographed by Dougie and his team in some detail, although we have Historic Environment Scotland planning to do a detailed survey of all the walls in the church, hopefully later this year. And we hope also that they'll give us some help with consolidating the church walls. But the graffiti, some aspects of the graffiti are quite close to the Bergen stick, which is associated with King Haakon's fleet in Bergen, obviously in Norway. And although the graffiti has been interpreted, at least here on Ling in the past, as being associated with King Alexander II's fleet in 1249, as he sailed up to negotiate with Ewan MacDougall, there are certainly aspects to the graffiti which could place it more firmly in a kind of Norwegian camp. And then, of course, we get on to the Kingdom of the Isles emerging. MacDougall's dominating in this area, of course. Choosing the wrong side compared to the MacDonalds who supported Bruce. So they lose although they regain some of their estates, some of their territory later, they've lost power, and they're replaced by the MacDonalds and the Lordship of the Isles. And what we do have, although we don't have any direct certain evidence for activity on Ling itself, what we do have, and in fact I can see it now from my office, is Dunconnell, which is one of the fortresses, clearly dating from the Kingdom of the Isles, but part of the northern defence system for the Lordship of the Isles. So being given to the MacLeans. So the MacLeans were given lands either side of the Firth of Lorn, so Lochbury and MacLean of Duart. And Duart was given Dunconnell, various lands, Scarbalunga, lands on Seal, and the lands of Ardlarach on Ling. And MacLean Bristol, is it Bristol MacLean? MacLean Bristol. On Col has argued that the lands of Ardlarach were given to serve and support the fortress of Dunconnell. And I've not, this is one that I really want to go before I end up in the ground. It's quite difficult, obviously, to get access to because the rock rises directly out of the sea. But on the main one, which you can just see here to the left of the ranging pole, are about a good 15 buildings, sub-rectangular buildings. And there's also, there are also further buildings on the smaller rock to the north and walling on this one as well. And of course it dominates this important, this seaway here. On we go. Okay, of course, we're now into a period where we start to have rather more concrete evidence, and we can start to trace things on the ground. And one of the, I think one of the main contributions of the ACFA survey has been to systematically trace all the improvement farmsteads, and in doing so, of course, identify whatever pre-improvement archaeology still exists. And that's not just the farmsteads, but obviously the corn kilns, and there are many of them on Ling because it was known for its corn. Mills, the boundaries, which Zoe and I have been doing in the last year, and of course the slate quarry buildings. So they all fall under, particularly fall under the Earl of Breithwaite from 1692 onwards. There are some records from when the Earl of Argyll had it. And in fact, this document here is one of the earliest. This is a 1658 one, but ended up in Dunolly. And I just wanted to thank, because I saw that she's here tonight, thank Sue Bryson for the most amazing work transcribing the Breithwaite documents. And we're still getting transcriptions now. And we haven't even started analysing all this, the transcriptions, the documents. And so that will be a big job for the future. And of course, some of this archaeology will be quite familiar elsewhere. So what we have here, of course, is that this is probably one of the most substantial of the kilns on Ling. This is at Ardinamar, where the survey identified what can only be described as a whole milling complex here, because there's mill pond and a second drying kiln and other stuff. I'll come back to that in a second. This was one of the early surveys of one of the pre-improvement townships and post-improvement farmsteads here at Ballachuan. And of course it has a very nice we reckon it's a 20th century sheep fank here, which of course was conveniently constructed from stone from the earlier buildings. And here down at Ardling, down at the southern end of the island, suggestions of some of the possibly pre-improvement enclosures and structures. Down at Ardling too, there's a walloping great, really long, circuitous dike, which runs kind of up north-south up through Ardling. And Francis Shaw had suggested that that was one that had been farmed as two separate farms already back in the 17th century. So this was a bit where I'd started thinking, what shall I do tonight? And it's to what extent can the survey identify some of the gaps in the evidence? So are there sites that actually correspond to all the things that were going on during the medieval period in particular? And I think one of the things that I think is quite possible, and it would be interesting to know whether this kind of pattern occurs, for example, in Tiree or Uis or elsewhere on the Isles, is what's possibly a system or network of watch and ward sites, as existed on the Isle of Man, for which in the Manx case, there are records from the 17th century which show that they both had day watches and night watches, obviously day watches for sea routes and the night watches in particular over anchorages and harbours. And this very nice promontory earthwork, there's no stonework, so a lot of these are earth structures. This is on the western side of Ardling, and it faces out over the Sound of Ling here, and this is the Grey Dogs between Lunga and Scarborough here. So a rather fabulous position. And from it, you get views all the way down the Sound of Jura, just as you do from this one, which is this one here, right at the bottom end, the farthest end of Ling, which is where Christine, we saw those otters. And Christine had to rush over to the little island here in order to add it to her list. So there's again a nice little earthwork on the top here. And Dougie, this is one of the things we want you to investigate in June. We've got some walling on the top of this this knoll here, which rises up as well, which needs investigation. There's one site here which has been, of course, classified in the past as a dune, but it's not, although it's made of stone, it's very rough, it's D-shaped, it's got a little wall that comes down here. It's obviously an intertidal location. And this one looks out to, this is Shuna here and the mainland here. So again, over this route into a fjord and into safe harbours. There's a very little baby structure which sits over this quite important, still important safe anchorage, deep anchorage up here. A quite interesting little lookout structure here, which has amazing views north up to the Firth of Lawn. So I think this is something that could merit further investigation in the future. Oh, and Julia, sorry, Blackmill Bay, this is yours because Julia lives just down below here. This is also very nice. This has a great view to Dunconnell, in fact. Again, it's an earthwork, so there's a kind of earth wall around it, and there's a sort of squarish structure inside and a smaller structure in that with a possible entrance here. And we think that there's also a kind of ditch of some kind here. Again, on a very nice little promontory. Then I think there's a big question of what are the early fermtouns or townships, because they're called townships in all the Argyll and Breadorpin documents. We know from Timothy Pont's mapping that there were 8 or 9 of the towns at the end of the 16th century. From evidence elsewhere, for example, in Morven, that would translate as possibly 4 or 5 in the 14th and 15th century, and maybe 3 or 4 a century before that. So there's an increase in number over time. So what are the early ones? What we do have, of course, is that we know that in 1390, the lands of, or at least we have a charter from 1390 that the lands of Ardlarach were handed by the MacDonalds to Maclean as part of the defence, system of defence in this area. And that these charters had already been, that agreement had already been embedded in earlier charters which no longer exist any longer. This structure here, which is has to be one of my favorite ones, although you can go back and visit it and visit it and visit it, and it's still a puzzle, is, as you can see, it's on a ridge with a view directly west out to Dunconnell here. This is within Ardlarach, so it's in this position here. It's a 17-meter diameter circular bank, but it has huge boulders embedded in it in some places. It seems to have a kind of internal cell of some kind at one point here. There are external features as well. And when I sent this drawing, which Zoe and I had done last year, partly because it was glorious weather, as you know, it was dry and we had time. And so we did a bit of what we call gardening on it. And so managed to expose quite a bit more of the stonework. And what Dougie reckons is that there's perhaps a sub-rectangular structure inside. So it is an extremely interesting site. Maybe it could be a little bit similar to some of the fortified homesteads that exist elsewhere in Argyll and Perthshire. At Leccamore, which is immediately north of Kilhatton, the old parish church of Kilhatton, so it may be significant. Within the later farmstead and pre-improvement township area, it's again a mound, and it has a kind of, seems to have an access trackway that runs up to the top. And the LiDAR shows we need to work on this further, but it may show a structure there as well. So again, the question would be, is this site here one of the earlier late medieval towns? And over at Ardnamar, this is one of Dougie's discoveries. And although it looks quite obvious now, it was deep in brambles and thorn bushes and you name it. So it was really quite well hidden. And it's, again, a kind of circular structure. I think it's probably about 15 or 16 meters diameter. Dougie, you can probably correct me because you know this better, I think. And it's kind of a leveled area cut into this sloping promontory. So what falls off the edge here is Ardnamar Bay and looking east to the mainland. And it's got a circular wall. And according to Dougie, there's evidence of something in the center. I stand there and look in some hope. I can't see it myself, but I defer to the expert on this one. And this whole area of Ardnamar is fascinating. I mean, it's so clearly an area which has had, perhaps continuous occupation from the prehistoric period up to the present day, because Ballycastle Iron Age fort is basically up on the hill here. A little bit further on, there's a nice oval sub-rectangular structure set in a clearing with a little bit of evidence of terracing and a little enclosure here. Again, you can see where the position is overlooking the anchorage and across to Torsa. And Ardinamar is again where this milling complex is. So perhaps a possible earlier mill site up here, horizontal mill. And then further down here, the remains of an overshot mill. And I think it's that one, Dougie, that's described as being in a ruinous condition in 1853. So it may be that this was all out of use by the mid-19th century, but there's a nice mill pond with sluices at the end, mill laid, 2 kiln barns, buildings here, and it's a real indication of how important grain was on Ling at one time. Then we've got we've got the Mickey Mouse, and we've got some other curious or perhaps less curious structures on which feedback would be very welcome. This one here was Dougie's, again, a Dougie discovery, a really exciting discovery, which is on the top of a ridge. In fact, we think that there's a sort of cleared area next to it. But immediately next door to this ridge is the ridge with Ballycastle, and over here is Leccamore Fort. There are, however, a few later sheilings, completely different from this, but it is an area, it is obviously an area of rough pasture, it was an area of common pasture, and there are a few little sheilings, which are quite rare on Ling, because obviously being quite a small island, transhumance wasn't quite so important. So it's there's a larger central cell. You can see the type of walling, boulders, quite nicely constructed. A little cell off here, but seemingly no access between the bigger cell and the smaller one. The same here. This cell here is this one here, and a possible entrance or a possible third cell here. So all suggestions, please, very welcome. Then this one, which is quite close to Ballachuan settlement, so at the back of Cullypool here. And again, this is one that was missed by the survey, and you might say this is quite a bit of a surprise, but as we know, it depends on the day, the weather, which direction you're coming from, the light. But it's a circular structure, and when Zoe and I reported it back to Dougie, I think by then he was going, oh dear, and not another one. He said, oh, could it be a burnt mound? So we went and poked around with skewers, and it's all turf. So it's a nice little circular turf structure with a little entrance here. And then further up on the ridge are some curving turf banks. It's quite close to one of the dikes that is probably an improvement dike dividing Ballachuan when it was divided into 2 farms. But again, we don't know what they could be at all, no idea. And then our most recent discovery, which we call Dawn's house, because she was very insistent that we had a look under the extremely deep bracken. It's, for those who know, it's south of Cairn. So this is the view, this is this safe anchorage here, and you can see Torsa just here. And we're pretty sure that it's a croft house. Perhaps it's Ballachuan croft, because we do have records for that. And there's some very nice, narrow, hand-dug cultivation rigs around it. An old turf and stone dike, and some other curious features, which look like lazy beds, which we really don't have as not like the Western Isles ones. We really don't have on Ling, but we seem to have those. So again, this would benefit from more investigation, because although it seems to be like a little house at this end, there's a lot more going on at this end, and there's evidence of structures around it as well. And it is on this raised mound again. I think we're nearly there. Yep. So this is a big thank you from Luing History Group. Thank you to everyone. And that's it.